Hello, I'm Maureen Reidy, the President and CEO of the Paley Center for Media, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a very exciting and timely Paley Impact program right on the heels of yesterday's Election Day. Tonight's program marks the 5th annual James P. Jimirro Media Impact Series at the Paley Center, all thanks to an incredibly generous gift from Jim Jimirro, who is the creator and founding president of the Disney Channel and Walt Disney Home Video. The James P. Jimirro Media Impact Series casts a special light on the role of media in influencing thought and behavior. Like tonight's event, future programs will be organized to reach the Paley community, industry professionals, students, and the public at large, encouraging a more thoughtful, critical engagement with the media. Never before has Paley's mission been more vital, as media has been the undisputed connector to a nation in these unprecedented times. And Paley is uniquely positioned to meet this moment with impactful conversations led by influential voices, such as the respected journalists and esteemed commentators that we have joining us tonight for a thought-provoking conversation titled "The President and the Press: Joe Biden's First Year and the Media's Relationship with the New Administration." This evening is also the first anniversary of President Joe Biden's election, and these leading experts will share their insights into how media is fulfilling its vital role to ensure that the public is given an objective look at the administration and that all perspectives are represented in their coverage. We welcome Tim Graham, executive editor of NewsBusters; Errin Haines, editor-at-large of the 19th; Patrick Healy, deputy opinion editor for the New York Times; Mollie Hemingway, senior editor at the Federalist; Gerald Seib, Washington executive editor for the Wall Street Journal; and Sean Spicer, author of Radical Nation and former White House press secretary. Our moderator is Mark Lodato, dean of the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. Now, before we start the program, there's some brief housekeeping notes. If you are tweeting, our hashtag on Twitter is #Paley. And we invite you to join our community and subscribe to our Paley YouTube channel. You can just click on the subscribe button below this video. But now it's my great honor to welcome our dear friend, Jim Jimirro. Thank you so much, Jim, for your support of tonight's program and our annual Media Impact Series. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Maureen. And good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Let me also thank the Paley Center for agreeing to my proposal to do this series and for the remarkably professional way they have organized this evening's program. I want to introduce briefly tonight's discussion by saying something anecdotal. But the anecdotes in what I'm about to say are so voluminous and so consistent that they approach actual science. It is this: I have never met anybody in any walk of life, sports, entertainment, the arts, certainly politics, who, if he had dealings with the press, didn't think he was treated unfairly. Not once. But aside from these subjective feelings, treatment by the press can actually be scientifically analyzed. We can look at and indeed measure tone, innuendo, choice of words. We can measure a reporter's intent by observing any number of qualities. Is the coverage respectful, dismissive, fawning, challenging, courteous, dubious, adversarial, deferential, reverential, antagonistic, snarky, or any one of a number of adjectives that can actually be observed and measured and quantified? And most important of all is the media decision about where and how and if to cover a story in the first place. The most important power the media has is the power to minimize or even withhold coverage. 1 year ago today, Joe Biden was elected president of the United States. The tone and the tenor of his coverage was clear the very next morning. Tonight, with this year-long hindsight, our stellar panel will examine the media's relationship with President Biden and contrast it with that of previous presidents. We trust you will find it insightful, educational, interesting, and most important, useful. With that, I would like to introduce the moderator for this evening, the Dean of the SI Newhouse School of Communications at Syracuse University, and the alma mater for my graduate degree in media, by the way, Mark Lodato.
Jim, thanks so much. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you all here tonight, and I appreciate the invitation to talk with this group. I think it's going to be a terrific conversation. I am Mark Lodato, Dean of the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications here at Syracuse University, and I'm excited to moderate this important conversation about the media's vital role in covering the White House, especially in the first year of a new administration. Our goal really here tonight is to gain an expert understanding of this unique and impactful relationship, as well as to explore the impact that the media's coverage has on the presidency and on the public. So again, joining us tonight is a wonderful group: Patrick Healy, Tim Graham, Errin Hayes, Mollie Hemingway, Gerald Seib, and Sean Spicer. And again, it is a wonderful day to have this conversation following up on the election yesterday and the one-year anniversary of this administration. And Jerry, I really want to start with you tonight. You have, in your role at the Journal, covered Washington, D.C. for decades and seen administrations come and go. Can you describe for us a little bit, when a new president comes into office, do media outlets see this as an opportunity for a new start, so to speak, on how they cover the White House?
First of all, thanks for doing this. Thanks for having us. This is an important conversation, a good contribution. And yes, I'll play the old guy role, I guess. I got to Washington in the final months of the Carter administration, and I've covered every administration since. So that makes it 8 presidents. And to go back to something Jim said at the outset, I'm still waiting for the White House and the president that thinks they've been treated well by the press through the Biden administration. I'm still waiting. That's not how it works. The relationship between the press and any president and any White House is tense. It's skeptical, and it can be confrontational. I think that generally there is an attempt to either consciously or unconsciously give a new president, a new administration, a bit of a honeymoon period, a break-in period. I suspect Sean would think President Trump didn't get that, but he was, I think, the exception to the rule. I think the arrival of Joe Biden was kind of more of a return to what most of us see as more normal kind of relationships and behavior. Joe Biden, knew a lot of people in the press, had been covered by a lot of us for a long time. The Biden White House set out to behave normally, I guess, if that's the right word. And I think it probably benefited from that at the outset. But those are fleeting sentiments and tendencies. And eventually they hit the rocks of reality. And I think for the Biden administration, the Biden White House, I think those rocks of reality came in Afghanistan in July and August, where I think the scenes were ugly and the coverage was brutal. And I think to the extent there was a Biden press honeymoon, if there was one, it ended then. And I think it's probably over for good, because that's the way these things tend to work. And I think Democrats discovered yesterday in the election what can happen when things go south. And that's what we chronicle in the press. And I think that's our job. And I think it's what we always do.
Thanks, Jerry. Let me turn that same question over to Patrick now from the Times perspective. Does your organization see this as an opportunity to restart when you see this change in administration, or is it simply business as usual with a new occupant?
Well, I'm now in the opinion section, so I don't want to speak too much for the newsroom. But I don't think it's a reset. I think we ask big questions, both in opinion and in the newsroom, about what the goals of a new administration are, what their intents are, and what they promised to Americans before the election, and how that's being delivered. So I thought it was interesting that the newsroom made the decision with the incoming Biden administration to put a reporter whose background really is in writing about the economy and economic policy, Jim Tankersley, on the White House team of reporters. Clearly, the economy was, and is an enormous issue for a new administration. And so I think that there was a real desire to get that much more into substance and policy, with the incoming administration. I think for the Times opinion section, I think what we're trying to do is really start conversations and focus on arguments and ideas that a new administration is coming in with. What was different about this, Mark, was that we had January 6th and we had the strange experience of an outgoing president who really wouldn't accept the results of the election. So as much focus as we were putting on some of the new ideas that the administration was bringing, we had to reckon with what was going on in the country and sort of the shock of that. So as much as we were writing about Joe Biden, we were also doing long op-ed guest essays about Josh Hawley and who he was and what his role had been on January 6th. So in some ways, I don't see there really having been a honeymoon here. I think it definitely is different than the Trump administration, but there's been just a continuity of coverage around what has been, not to sound hyperbolic, but a period of the country that we'd never seen before in terms of a peaceful transfer of power, but a transfer of power that was really being rejected, by millions of Americans.
I certainly want to get Sean's take on this in one moment, but before we do, I'm curious, Tim, from your perspective, is this something you can measure and something you can research in this transitional times between administrations?
Yes. I mean, you can always measure, just as Jim said. I mean, you start by saying which stories are they doing and for how long? How many interviews is the president giving? Trump gave a lot more interviews than Biden has. What's the tenor of the briefing room? What kind of sound bites do the news media use for the spokesman? I think we can safely guess that the sound bites of Jen Psaki on the nightly news are very somber. They're very informational. They're very explanatory. None of them are considered gaffes. That is not Sean Spicer's experience in the opening months of the Trump administration. I think what I sense and what we're looking to measure, and of course our feeling about it, is that I think we all know, as Patrick suggested, that the media's approach to Trump was a frenzied resistance, a fear, a phobia, a sense that the entire world was going upside down. And now they have that feeling of, now we're back, we've gone from resistance to assistance, where it's the media's role not to expose, but merely to explain what the president seeks, what the Democrats are trying to achieve. It has a much gentler tone. It is absolutely a honeymoon compared with the last president.
I just have to jump in and say, I did not say that the media's approach to the Trump administration was frenzied resistance, but I understand your opinion there, Tim. Now that I'm in the opinion business, I get it.
So let's go on the inside and bring Sean into this. Sean, from your perspective, what do you see as the primary responsibility of the media when you're covering the White House in your sort of role when you were there?
I think the media's responsibility, regardless of administration or frankly beat, is to give people the facts and frankly without opinion. And too often it's, and Tim and the Media Research Center and the NewsBusters document a lot of this, but it's what they cover, what they don't cover, the tone in which they cover it is crucial. And so, and the skepticism, right? So what Biden does is always altruistic. They're seeking a goal that's worthy. Everything that Trump did was bad. Nothing was good. Everything, when he screwed something up, it's a disaster. When Biden, we're now on we made fun of infrastructure week over and over again during the Trump administration. We're now on like week 47 in the Biden administration, and no one brings it up. I mean, he's still trying hard from fighting for the American people. It's an embarrassment what's going on in the briefing room. And I think anyone objectively who can look at a clip of the press briefing between when I was there, frankly, anyone subsequently, and what it is with Jen it's not something that I think is debatable. The press, when Patrick was on the reporting side, clearly came in an adversarial role. I don't think journalists are there to present stories and facts and say, this is what happened. Here's the who, what, where, when. They have crossed that line. In Trump, it was very much advocating why he was wrong. And in the Biden administration is why he was right. Let me just give one quick example that I think is I thought was so fascinating. About, I think it's 2 weeks ago, it might be 3 now, there was the first ever repatriation ceremony in the United States where we were repatriating 38 Korean soldiers who had died in the Korean War, and they were repatriating 6 U.S. service members. President Moon of Korea flew over to Joint Base Hickam, Pearl Harbor, to present the 6 U.S. service members, right? Not one person from the Biden administration greeted President Moon. So on a diplomatic level, that's just embarrassing that an ally wasn't greeted. He was greeted by a military officer. Number 2, just in terms of respect for the military and the service, that was highly disgraceful. And yet not one media organization covered it except for me and my show on Newsmax. And you think that the South Koreans covered it, so clearly it was news to them. But it's the omission, Mark, that I think is so key right now. They literally do what they can to cover up for any of the mistakes, hypocrisy, double standards, and failed policies of this administration.
All right. Well, thanks, Sean. And I really want to sort of steer us back on topic about the coverage of the office rather than the individuals themselves all the time. And, I'd love to bring in Errin in on this in terms of how you've seen things evolve, especially in this age of new media. It was a simpler time 10, 20 years ago. And I'm curious from your perspective, how does the transformation of what we have in today's world, cable news, everything else, social media, how does that impact the way an administration communicates and the way the media does its job?
Well, I think that what we're seeing, especially in the past year, is that new media is absolutely essential. And this is certainly a proof of concept for my newsroom, the 19th, which started in January 2020. So at the start, really, of the 2020 primary election season, because to be honest, those of us who founded the 19th, which is named for the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote, but not all women. We have an asterisk in our logo for the omission of the Black women who were frankly thrown under the bus as white women marched to get their right to vote with the ratification of that amendment. But anyway, we believed that our political journalism was frankly like, this conversation has been up until this point, very white and very male. Right. And so we believed that the fastest and best way to change that was to start over. And so we did that. And, with our newsroom being relatively new, we focus on politics and policy, not from the White House press briefing room, because frankly, we're so new that we're not credentialed in the briefing room. And so that gives us really a vantage point to assess this administration from outside the briefing room, from outside of Washington. Our newsroom is distributed across the country. We have people on the ground everywhere from Iowa to California to New York to Washington to Florida, talking to voters about what they voted for. And if, in fact, what they voted for is unfolding in this administration through policy, if their lived experience is being reflected in the agenda of this new administration. And so this also includes really kind of including a lot of the voices that frankly have been unseen and unheard in this democracy for far too long, whether we are talking about women who are the majority of the electorate, but who are often treated as a special interest group by too much of our legacy mainstream media outlets, and other marginalized groups in this country who we know are part of a growing coalition in our democracy and who are civically engaged, not just in terms of elections, but also who are looking to the people that they elected to govern on their behalf as well as the majority of the country. And so, with that in mind, so many of the voters that I have talked to have been laser focused on what the administration has and has not been able to accomplish. Issues like voting rights, criminal justice reform, certainly immigration this summer was huge. The pandemic, which we know disproportionately impacted women, people of color, other marginalized groups, they were looking for us to really explain to them what was happening on those fronts in ways that would affect their daily lives. And so, what we have seen is that the coverage that we are providing, the choices that we are making about the stories that we want to tell about who and where we are as a democracy and how that's being reflected in the administration's choices is something that they're not necessarily seeing in a lot of other places.
Well, let me pull Mollie into this conversation as well. And Mollie, I'm curious from your perspective, we've got nonstop news and information, multiple platforms and outlets. And I would suspect that it can be really difficult to get a clear picture of how the public feels about the president. And when we look at the nation in total, do you think there's such a thing as popular opinion anymore when it comes to the president and what we're seeing today?
Well, it's an interesting question to ask, given how public opinion polling for the current president has shown him to be off a cliff in terms of what the people want and how that relates to media coverage. I want to just point out that there is a group of people that does believe they are treated fairly by the media. The most recent Gallup poll showed that the group of people who 3 out of 4 believe they are treated fairly by the media, that's Democrats. Only 9% of Republicans feel that their views are represented fairly by the media. That's for good reason. And it's because our media in the last 5 years, and this is directly related to their posture toward the office of the president under the current or under the previous holder of that, moved from mere bias in favor of Democrat policy positions and health of the Democrat Party into actual propaganda and outright bias. I think for this conversation to have any value or meaning, we do have to remember what the press did with the previous administration. And I think about the current administration, the first press conference, I think, was March 25th. It was embarrassing. It was embarrassing, like as a journalist, to watch what the media did, gently asking questions. You know, you were so kind, and that's why we have a border crisis, right, Mr. President? It was unbecoming of anybody who thinks that they're professional. Compare that with the previous office holder, where the first press conference, I think, was before the inauguration, and it was about a delusional conspiracy theory that Donald Trump had stolen the 2016 election by colluding with Russia. This became the main focus of much of our media for years. Every day they dropped out news stories. I don't know if they believed this delusional conspiracy theory that Donald Trump stole the election or if they pretended to. Either way, that's why they don't have any credibility outside of their co-partisans. This is a major crisis for our country because we know we need a free press to preserve liberty. We know we need a press that holds people responsible, and they can't move from cartoonish hostility to gentle sycophancy based on who's holding the office. It is true what Jerry said, that we used to have like a honeymoon period for presidents, let them get their footing. Their failure to do that during the Trump administration and their failure to do that in any way on any topic for the Trump administration means they don't have credibility. But if I might just further state, the way they responded to the Biden administration, where they didn't get in any way adversarial, which is the proper posture. Being adversarial is good. Being hostile is not necessarily helpful. They didn't get adversarial until one of the wars that they tend to like was threatened, in which case they then decided that they could ask tough questions of Joe Biden for a couple weeks and then go back to their general posture. Public opinion has not reflected media coverage. And it's fascinating that public opinion is so off the cliff, given what the media have done to help this president and help him in move his agenda. You know, they ask questions like, don't you think you should work harder to get rid of the filibuster? That's not what a journalist does. That's what a left-wing activist might do. And the popular opinion shows that the people are just recognizing the reality of the crisis of the situation that the country is in.
Food for thought for this group. I'm going to play the role of the dean of the journalism school here. Is all of us, I think, understand the desire to and the importance of having an accountable free press in a democracy. And I would love to, in a moment, talk about what do we need to do to get back to that point. But first, I want to just touch base with Jerry one more time as our veteran here who's covered so many presidencies since the Carter administration. I mean, Jerry, is this new, what we're experiencing today from in your eyes, this sort of polarization description that we're hearing here tonight?
Well, there's a lot new in the whole political scene over the last 5 or 6 years. This is a time of considerable turmoil, and that includes people in the political system. It includes those of us in the press who cover the people who make the political system work. So there's a lot that's new and unprecedented here. I think people didn't know how to adjust to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, by the way, called people in the press, this is long before he was president, the horrible people on earth. So there was plenty of hostility going both ways in that confrontation from the very beginning of his campaign. I think that, and there's a lot of sweeping generalizations in this conversation so far. I think the reality here is that people, we in the press are have to respond to our readers. And we have a test every day at the Wall Street Journal. Do the people who put money down to pay my salary and to buy the product that we produce, trust us enough to continue to make that investment in what we do? We live in a marketplace where there are no freebies. What we sell is credibility and trustworthiness. And you can play with that for a while, but you cannot play with that for a long time, or you're risking your own ruin. And I think that should not be lost here. We have responsibilities, but we also have a reality that we have to think about. I would just make this one final point. I think and this is about the institution of the White House and coverage of it, not about any participant or occupant of it. I covered the White House as my beat for 4 or 5 years. I went to the White House press briefing almost every day. That's not where I did my reporting. I mean, that is useful as a kind of a tip sheet, a kind of a sense of what's going on today. Real coverage of any president, real coverage of any White House happens outside that briefing room, outside the view of the cameras, and in the vein of real traditional reporting. That's what covering a White House is. And I think there has been a tendency, and this goes back several administrations, for people to equate what they see on TV in the White House press room. And by the way, I'm old enough to have covered the White House when they didn't allow live TV coverage of the briefings, and they were a lot better. But those briefings do not equate to coverage of a president or a White House. They're related to it, in my view, only vaguely related to it.
Well, let me throw this out to the group. Is the media's job to tell the public what's happening in the White House, or is it to tell the White House what's happening in the world with the people and bringing that conversation to the White House?
Yes. The answer is both. But I think there's not enough of the latter that happens. And certainly, the folks who are, assigned to cover the White House are not necessarily the folks who are spread out across this country, actually talking to the people that are impacted by the policies of the administration and of our federal government. And so it is important to have both of those roles happening because, this is a representative government and a government in which, the government and its citizens are supposed to be in concert and in conversation with each other, right? And so journalism is the bridge in so many ways for that conversation to be happening. Public opinion polls are great, but, behind those numbers are actual people, Americans, our friends, our neighbors, our families. And we need to know, because I don't think we have done a good enough job of telling people about the folks in their community, where they are, what they're thinking about, what is motivating them, because all of that ends up ultimately being political, at least once every 4 years, if not more often, as we saw last night.
Can I just jump in quickly and completely second all of that? Because I really think we would all be better off if we spent a little more time or a lot more time talking to people outside of the bubble we live in here. And I mean that for every journalist on every beat. I also mean it, frankly, for a lot of people who work in the government. We ought to get connected with the people we're speaking to a lot more than we do. And I think that's gotten worse over the last few years.
Yeah, and even a pool reporter that's on the road doesn't have, they just don't have the time to really do that, to really interact with people that they may encounter along the way. They don't have time to do that. But this is why local journalism, which I continue to be a champion of, is so important, because that is where a lot of those conversations are happening, and why we need to continue to pay attention to and support those outlets.
Isn't that a lesson we say the press should have learned in 2016, that concept of getting more in touch with the everyone between New York City and Los Angeles? And have we learned anything in those years? Are we seeing more of that today? For those of you working in newsrooms,
yes,
are there more reporters deployed across the country?
Yes, start a newsroom. Because, yes.
Go ahead, Errin. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Sean. That is my short answer.
I was going to say that you brought this up, and I had those meetings after 2016. I literally had NBC, a couple other ones where we sat down and they said, we missed this. We're going to set up pop-up bureaus in Trump country, whatever that means. And somehow for like 8 minutes, that was going to solve the problem. But that does say something. I mean, think about the fact that they're living, a lot of these reporters live in urban enclaves. They're talking among themselves. They don't see issues that affect. You just have to look at Virginia to realize this, that, it was a 50-50 race. And frankly, even if it was supposed to be 50-50, the idea that 50% of the people don't agree with the narrative, and look at Mollie's statistics that she handed out. The bottom line is that people on the right consistently, and even more so now, do not believe the news accurately covers them, that it is biased. And so you can make up the excuses you want about, but if that consistently is an issue and growing more so, that folks on the right distrust the media, that they don't believe they cover things, that they have a bias, then at some point you think to yourself, either you fix it or you just agree with it, right? So there is no attempt that I have seen in any mainstream media newsroom, not one, to actually sort of figure out how to add people to represent that. None. And I think the New York Times had at one point some dude who, voted Republican for student council, and that was their effort to do it. But there's no effort at the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News to cover anything that exists on the right, the problems, the trials, the tribulations. It's dismissed. Everything that's a problem of the right is disinformation, racism, white supremacy, as opposed to potentially real problems and concerns that they have. And there's no attempt to understand the underlying causes. And by dismissing people and then accusing them of being bad people, further creates a gulf between people on the right and the distrust that they have in the media.
I got to throw that over to Patrick and get his thoughts on that. I mean, how do you bring more people into the tent? Is that something you worry about from your perspective, given what I would describe as the popular opinion of your employer?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And let me just say, I really agree with what Errin, I think, eloquently said. And I agreed with the point that Sean made at the beginning about, many reporters living in urban enclaves. I think that's really true. And I think we asked ourselves, at the Times, I'm sure other newsrooms did as well, we can't be sitting in New York City and deciding every morning what the story is about America from, New York City or from Westchester County or, the Upper West Side. Like, you really can't do that. And so, Sean is right about that. That's been an issue, I think, with legacy and coastal media, for decades. And I think that the Times is a place, fortunately, thanks to, a lot of great subscribers that does have, a large number of national bureaus around the country. So I think that, what was happening in Georgia in 2018 and 2020, or in Arizona or in Florida, was captured well because we had full-time reporters who lived in those places. Now, to Sean's earlier point too, many of them were in cities. And I think we're asking ourselves again, okay, if you're going to have a bureau in Georgia or in Arizona, where do you want those people based? And when I was the politics editor in 2018 for the midterms and 2020 running the presidential coverage, we sent not only reporters just basically full-time on the road, but also hired stringers in, a good 10, states, and really tried to lean into what Errin was talking about with local journalism, finding people who had taken buyouts or may have been laid off because of the sad pullback in local journalism, and employ them and help us tell those stories from the ground, because we didn't want to be just making those calls up, from New York. I just say I certainly disagreed with a lot of what Sean said elsewhere. I think it's absolutely not true that the Times and other places would only write about, certain concerns, would only write about racism in America. I just don't believe that that's true. I think we and others made, a real effort in 2019 and 2020. And 2019,
that's not what I said, though, just so we're clear.
Well, it is what you said, Sean. You said that the only thing that media would write about, was racism and, anger.
No.
On the right. That's how we
don't mean to interrupt you, but I didn't say that's what you write about. Those were how you framed the people who had dissenting opinions. So, for example, and I literally played an entire reel on this tonight on my show. That's how they view the motives of folks. And so, with respect to Errin, I get it. There are people who do believe that there's a greater cause for voting rights. I respect that, right? I believe actually that efforts to secure the vote is not racist. I've believed this for 30 years that I've been in politics. Okay. But there is a framing that if you believe in voter ID and strengthening voter integrity and not letting people vote for 6.5 months, therefore you're racist and you want to suppress a vote. I fundamentally disagree with that. And my point I'll finish with this, Patrick, because I didn't want to hijack this, but I'm not saying that you write about those issues, is that there is a fundamental belief that people who oppose efforts that this administration or folks on the left are trying to achieve, if you don't agree with them, then you or that group is fundamentally racist or white supremacist or misogynist or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, I think, an accurate representation of the reporting of the New York Times.
Well, I totally disagree. I mean, you really don't know what's going on inside those conversations. But I have to say, like, the coverage in Georgia and in Florida and in Texas, and the interviews that we would do with Republican lawmakers who would make the case for the bills that they were trying to pass on voting rights and trying to understand the concerns that they had about the mistrust and the doubt that many of their supporters, other voters in the state, had. It was something that we took really seriously. We wanted to hear those voices. We saw, op-eds from people like that. No, and look, I understand that the New York Times and some other organizations are targets in this and have been for years. But I would just say, I think there's a real recognition that in this country, there are tens of millions of people who passionately supported and voted for Donald Trump, and many who similarly voted for, Joe Biden. And I don't think any media organization in business today really can survive, at a level of covering the country, if they're not trying to tell the stories in a good faith way, of people on both sides. I understand people see it differently, but that's really the intent.
Patrick, I don't think that's true, honestly. The whole idea that the New York Times and the Washington Post under Trump had marketing campaigns that were going after the anti-Trump vote. They used slogans like "democracy's dying in darkness," "the truth is more important than ever." They were clearly saying, we are going to build a subscriber base of people who do not agree with the current trend. I don't think anybody believes that the New York Times or the Washington Post are here to represent all of us, and that's the problem with the
Tim, what do you have against democracy? What do you have against truth? I don't understand you harping on the mottos. It's a little strange,
This is where I got a little concerned. We might go down this road. So I'm going to try and get us back on track. Okay, we're talking about coverage of the White House, of the office itself. And what I'm going to try and do is ask you all to look forward a little bit. Is what we've seen in year one exactly what we're going to see in years 2, 3, and 4? Is there going to be an evolution? And perhaps more importantly, what are those perhaps characteristics that we need or resources we need to bring to White House coverage to ensure that we're telling all of America's story?
Well, look, I'm happy to start. I think it's worth stepping back and thinking about what it means to cover a White House. What's your job? There's some tension in this because there are a couple of different jobs. And I struggled with this a lot when I was covering the White House as a reporter. Part of your job is to explain the person who leads the country to the country. Part of your job is to hold that person accountable. Part of your job is to be a skeptic of that person. Those are different roles. They're related. but it's hard to know what the right emphasis is supposed to be. I think over time, the press coverage of any president inevitably evolves away from explaining that person to being to holding that person accountable, to becoming more skeptical. I think that's a logical progression because they have a certain amount of time to enact their program, their ideas, and certainly reality steps in. And I think that's part of what you're seeing right now with the Biden White House. I mean, it is not in a vacuum that the president's job approval has gone from 52% to 42% over the last couple of months. That is in part a result of basically holding the Biden administration accountable for not achieving its goals and hitting its targets. That's the natural process.
Mollie, what's your take on that?
Oh, sorry.
I think it's clear that we have, just to be honest, the jig is kind of up for people on the right. They no longer trust major corporate media to be fair or accurate. And so I speak from a non-leftist perspective here, and I understand that's not shared by everybody. But from my perspective, what I'm curious about with what the media will be doing, I view them as existing almost as leadership of the Democrat Party. They kind of decide what they want.
Mollie, I checked. In the last quarter, in the third quarter, 4 of the top most viewed programs in cable news were on Fox News. This is not a monolithic picture here, and we should not present it as such.
So I do understand, and I actually work at Fox, and I'm very happy to work there, and they have amazing viewership right now, but they're still just one network out of many, and that they have individual programs that are crushing like a given hour doesn't really reflect.
I think too, Mollie, just for clear.
It doesn't.
I was going to get the Newsmax quote in there. Sorry.
Doesn't reflect the entire media environment. And I'm more interested in print media. And what I see there is, what I'm very curious to watch in the year to come is, do they view Biden and the direction of the party as a threat to their larger political control? Do they try to offer some messaging help because of seeing what happened in Virginia and New Jersey and other places? Or do they keep doubling down on the agenda? I'm also curious what they do to constrain Republicans. In general, the media have kind of taken this posture of enjoying separating the Republican Party from its own voters. I'll be curious how they do that, how they try to control who the next nominee is for the Republican Party for president, how they get involved in midterm elections. But it is to Jerry's point, it is a great media space. And by the way, I'm a subscriber to the Wall Street Journal, and I love it and recommend everyone subscribe. But they're kind of unique in how they're handling this moment, as they were unique in how they handled the previous presidency as well, in offering news and information without so much obvious bias in favor of one direction or another.
How much is social media influencing White House coverage today?
That's a great question. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's a fascinating thing, because I think Twitter in particular dominates a lot of the narrative of the White House press corps. I've seen it firsthand, and I'll talk to reporters, and sometimes they recognize it. It's almost like they'll say, you know what, you're right. This got, a million retweets, but that's not necessarily something that was, what Patrick was talking about earlier, that's not necessarily what people on a tractor in Iowa are doing, is reading Twitter or tweeting out they're working hard every day to put food on the table or to get harvest, right? But I'm being serious, because I think sometimes the same way that we discussed where people live and the enclaves that they live in, that I think that we look at mediums, in particular social media. And I think that it's great that you're bringing that up, Mark, because I think too often, I think sometimes journalists, and not just journalists, fair enough. I mean, I think pundits and people on television, whatever, will look at that as a reflection of what people sometimes are thinking. And you forget that it's Twitter is sort of the loud minority. And hopefully people catch themselves and say, okay, I got it. It got a lot of retweets, but that doesn't necessarily define where public opinion is or thought is. It means that the video might've been funny or had something catchy or a hashtag that caught on. So I think it's a good point that you're bringing up, because, a lot of journalists, and one quick thing, because I know I don't want to, is I think one of the things that's really important when we discuss coverage is, you asked the first question. I think what's lacking is curiosity. Meaning that I think that too many times I watch these press briefings, and the press secretary would make a statement, and it's sort of like, okay, thank you. And a lot of times I'm sitting back there. It's almost like watching a football game where I'm like, I wish you had a receiver open. And I'm thinking to myself, no. The follow-up is 3 days ago, you said the following. Why aren't you doing this? And I think to your first question, curiosity is something, and accountability is something that I think will be interesting to see if we get more or less of, because I don't think that that's been present, not just in the briefing room. And I think Jerry made a good point, but in general, there's a lack of curiosity and accountability for where things have been. And it'll be interesting where that heads.
I would definitely agree with Sean on that point, that Twitter is not America. And I say that all the time as a reminder to myself, as a reminder to my colleagues in our industry. Twitter is not America. Yes, I'm on there. I certainly am active on there. You can also catch me tweeting about Peppa Pig when I am not dealing with politics, because that is my escape from my day job. But, at least until, the Peppa Pig Adventure theme park opens down in Orlando down there for whoever's watching. No, the thing is, with the accountability piece, I think, especially the further away you can get from an election, folks can forget what it is that a president campaigned on, and what it is that they were supposed to deliver, and if in fact they are delivering that to the people, not only the people that voted for them, but to the people that they are serving, all of this country, right? And so, a year ago today, you had President Biden campaigning on a message of bipartisanship, healing, and unity. Those things have not yet materialized, right, in our country. And I think that has to be said. Why hasn't that happened yet? What is it going to take for that to happen? Has he abandoned that as a strategy? Like, these are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking. Instead of fighting about or reporting on the number that is in the legislation around infrastructure and Build Back Better, what we've been focused on at the 19th is what's actually in the thing potentially, like what people could potentially get. Because just to Sean's point, somebody sitting on a tractor in Iowa is not so concerned. I mean, yes, he's had to learn about what budget reconciliation and the filibuster are, but really, what folks are wanting to know is, well, is that bridge that I drive across every day, is that going to be one of the things that gets paid for if this thing passes? Or, what's going to happen with the child tax credit? Or am I going to be able to take care of my mom who got sick in the pandemic and who I now have to figure out elder care for? Like, these are the things that people care about, that they want to be informed about, like the policy part that is affecting people's real lives. I feel like is something that we have to continue to stay on, because that is the kind of stuff. I mean, yes, a lot of us, especially being on social media, what social media does is it makes us think that everybody is as engaged and obsessed with this stuff as we are. And that is just simply not the case. But they are trying to live their lives every day, and they would probably appreciate knowing how their government is helping them to do that, and regardless of party.
To Erin's point, not just covering the policy, it seems like so much of what we cover is horse race politics. Is this bill going to pass today or tomorrow? Is it up or down? But we don't talk about what's actually in the bill, which I understand is difficult when it's ever changing. But also, we never get to what the long-term implications are as well, or we rarely get to the long-term implications. And all of these things are important. And that's what ideally journalists would be doing: less narrative pushing and more helping people understand. We have such tools and access to people who are thinking down the line and who are understanding policy disputes. If we could share that information rather than pushing an agenda or pushing a narrative, the public would be doing better and civility would be improved. People could have conversations over shared sets of facts, and all of that would be good for the country.
I just wanted to throw in one quick point about accountability, because it depends on which voters you're holding accountable to. So you could say, for example, if Caitlin Collins stands up and asks President Biden, don't you think the filibuster is a racist relic? Some people are going to think that's holding Biden accountable. And other people are going to say that's basically ripping apart the traditions of the country. So even the concept of accountability depends on which side of the politics you're on.
So how do we do a better job? I guess we got to start thinking about some closing thoughts here, because we're beginning to run out of time. I lead a school where I have alums who cover the White House every day, and I have dozens, if not hundreds, of young people who want to become journalists, but they're a little bit scared given the current landscape. What is this career going to be like? So, what is it that we can do? What can we change in the way the media covers an administration to move things forward? And I'd love to hear from each one of you as a closing thought. And Jerry, you raised your hand.
Yeah, because I think we finally stumbled across something that we all actually agree on, which is that we need to do a lot better, and I mean across the board, in covering the substance of what is being debated in Washington, not just the debate in Washington. I mean, I think if I were to fault the press generally, and I hesitate to generalize after complaining that it's too much generalization, but I don't think any of us have done as well as we should have covering the issues that are actually being debated in the coronavirus stimulus plan, certainly in the Build Back Better. Bernie Sanders put out a statement 2 weeks ago saying, the reason Build Back Better is failing is the mainstream media has failed. It only covers the argument, not the substance. So maybe if we covered more of the substance, it would make it less popular. I don't know, but he's got a point. And we should be, and I would, if I had a desire for the next year, it would be that we move away from personalities, debate, and politics, and more onto substance, because these are issues that really matter to Americans, and they want to know, they deserve to know, and I think we're not doing well in serving them in that sense.
Absolutely. I mean, this is honestly exactly why the 19th exists, is because we wanted a more informed and empowered electorate. And that comes with actually telling them what's in it for them in terms of what their government is doing in their name and with their tax dollars. That is very important for us to communicate to our audience on a regular and consistent basis, and to be focused on issues and not necessarily personalities, to Jerry's point. But I think, again, the other point, we have the blessing of being based outside of Washington. And I think that just necessitates for our newsroom the imperative that we will do voter-centered coverage, that we will hear from the people that could potentially be impacted by this administration and what they are doing, by whoever it is that they have elected up and down the ballot, but sure, especially at the federal government level, because so much of the 2020 election was about, wanting somebody in office who was going to respond to a global public health crisis, to a racial reckoning, to, seeing a threat to, certain rights in the case of a lot of voters. So, with that being the case, hearing from those voters about how they think it's going, and voters on all sides. I mean, at the 19th, we strive to be a home for whoever wants to live here, whether they actually end up living there or not. And so that includes people on all, across the ideological spectrum, because there are too many people who are unseen and unheard, regardless of their politics in this democracy. And so hearing from as many of them as often as possible, I really do think is our best and highest use as an industry.
Sean, what's your take? A change you'd like to see in how an administration is covered to bring us to a better place?
Well, I would think two things that are important. To Erin's point, I think that it's one thing to say what's in the bill, and I think that would be a great start, and I applaud that as a goal. But I also think that, remember that under explaining some consequences, and that's where I think sometimes the right feels like saying we're going to spend this money for free community college, right? I think a lot of people say that's a great concept. Not explaining the financial implications of that is telling half the story. I mean, there's no such thing as free, and yet so many times, and so that's just one example, but I think sometimes understanding the full picture and hearing both sides, having an openness is I think what's missing in a lot of it, right? Because here's everything that's in it and here's what's in it for you. But again, you're not, like you would with a product, reading the fine print and saying, well, here's the downside to some of this, or here's the other side. The other thing, and I'll kind of, just because you're a dean, I did an analysis in my last book. And I think one of the things that I at least looked at, and I thought is at journalist schools, we seem to be doing more of training journalists to advocate. And I say that respectfully because I looked at the mission statements of several of the journalism schools, and it talks about making the world a better place. I don't personally believe the job of a journalist is to make the world a better place. It is to explain to voters what's going on. And as Errin said, here's what's in things, and then they make a decision. The journalist goal shouldn't be deciding what they deem is a better place. That's them making a decision, what's good and bad. And I think if you're coming out of journalism school, having understood a mission statement that your goal is to make the world a better place as we've defined it, then you're immediately going to cover everything that you think is good and deem certain things that you deem bad based on your worldview. And so I think a little bit more of defining the role of what journalist is important. And then secondly, making sure that people understand the consequences, not just what's in things, but the impact that a lot of the legislation would have.
Good feedback. And I want to make sure we get to Mollie, Patrick.
Having been a media critic for decades now, I've kind of given up hope. I've offered so many thoughts on how to move away from agenda pushing into factual reporting, how to deal with the structural bias that's in newsrooms, to bring in outside voices. I mean, I mentioned that only 9% of Republicans, according to Gallup, trust the media to report their views fairly and accurately. And Republicans are a very large group in this country, but there are a ton of groups who might not have that many numbers, who also feel that their views are not accurately represented by the media. I have not seen much of major media do much of anything to improve their position. So I now kind of think, okay, just admit that they don't care about getting better and just start doing much better jobs of having alternate news sources like Errin. I started a newsroom 8 years ago, the Federalist, where we have views from outside the Beltway, outside New York, and we do reporting every day because we weren't satisfied with what was being done. These places need to be well funded. They need to be supported so that it's not just those large voices that are doing so much to kind of harm the discourse, and that other viewpoints are represented. So I think, it also is important that they be able to compete at the level where they can hold presidents accountable and push issues into the national discourse, so that it's not just that stranglehold from that same small elite cabal that is completely out of touch with the rest of the country.
I'm sorry you've almost given up hope, and I threw in the almost there. I'm the glass half full sort of guy. So I guess that's what you need to do when you lead a communication school is do your very best to improve the world in the journalism space in which we live, and try and make this a more equitable process. So Patrick, what about from your perch? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, we have to, I think, understand the lack of trust that we've talked about at different points tonight. I've met progressive voters who are really mistrustful of the New York Times and other media. I've met conservative voters who are really mistrustful of the Times and the media. We've got to be open about that and have humility around that and think about how to deal with it. Because sitting in the White House press room or in the DC bubble and just writing stories that really only other elites, are going to read is not going to work. It's not healthy for the media. It's not healthy long-term. It's not healthy for democracy. It's something we've got to change. And part of it is, I think is thinking hard and rethinking the stories that we tell about voters, because there is that mistrust. And as everyone on the call knows, there's the gathering, there's just a classic form, kind of the voter story. It's sometimes been called the diner story. It's that awful story where someone from Manhattan parachutes into a town and spends half a day talking to random people on the sidewalk. Yes, I've done that too. We've got to rethink that. I mean, what I want to see more
and who even gets to be a voter, Patrick, right?
Absolutely.
Who even say gets to be a voter?
And absolutely, who we choose. We come from the outside and sort of we choose. And one of the pieces that I did this year that I was very happy with was we did a focus group. I did a focus group with Frank Luntz of about 15 Trump voters talking about race in America, on the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, and talking about how they saw race in America, how they felt about how the media covered them, covered Trump, covered race. And it was just a really thoughtful, revealing conversation. I think in part the value for a lot of liberal New York Times readers, and other New York Times readers was hearing kind of unfiltered voices. I think the 19th does that really well. I think other organizations do. I think that the Times is trying to do more of that, and we need to, where we hear what people are saying. We don't apply narratives. Like I understand where Sean is coming from in terms of that, and where we're sort of layering on or even like, frankly, even like fact checking people, in real time. We have to let people talk. We have to listen to people and try to understand where they come from, have humility around that.
Thank you, Patrick. And Tim, I'm sorry, we don't have a ton of time, but 30 seconds for you.
It's very simple. If I was talking to your students, the first thing you do is give the conservative and Republican half some space and some time. Right now, with all of this Build Back Better bilge, it's all Democrats fighting with other Democrats, talking to Biden, talking to Psaki, going over to Pramila Jayapal. Hey, there's a Republican half of Washington that you're not putting on the air. That's the first thing you need to do, is make sure both parties or all parties get a say.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. This has been a terrific conversation tonight, and I feel privileged to be able to be here with you. So thank you to Patrick, Tim, Errin, Mollie, and Gerald, and Sean. And thank you for joining us for this James P. Jimirro Media Impact Series program. And a special thanks again for the invaluable support of Jim Jimirro. Don't forget to subscribe to the Paley Center YouTube channel right now. Just click on the subscribe button below this video. Be sure to support the Paley Center and consider becoming a Paley member by visiting paleycenter.org. Thanks again, everyone, for your time tonight. It was a pleasure, and have a good evening.